Welcome to Underwire History. The year is 1756, and Europe is teeming with tension. Great Britain and Prussia are on the cusp of a potentially devastating conflict, one that will test their alliance and shake the foundations of the continent. But amidst this stormy backdrop, a subtle yet crucial development is taking place: the Treaty of Westminster. Signed between Great Britain and Prussia, this treaty aims to guarantee neutrality, ensuring that neither party engages in hostilities against each other. This may seem like a straightforward agreement, but its implications are far-reaching and complex. For one, it sets a precedent for future alliances and treaties, influencing the delicate balance of power on the continent. By establishing a framework for cooperation, the Treaty of Westminster effectively creates a web of constraints that will shape the decisions of European powers for years to come. In this critical juncture, we find ourselves at the crossroads of geopolitics, where state interests, economic considerations, and military might intersect in an intricate dance. As we delve into the intricacies of this treaty, its impact on international relations becomes clear. It is not just a diplomatic nicety, but a carefully crafted mechanism to maintain order in an increasingly volatile world. The Treaty of Westminster may seem like a straightforward agreement guaranteeing neutrality between Great Britain and Prussia, but its implications are far-reaching and complex. It establishes a framework for cooperation, creating a web of constraints that will shape the decisions of European powers for years to come. As European powers navigate this intricate dance of state interests, economic considerations, and military might, they must also contend with the consequences of their own actions. Great Britain's desire for Prussian assistance in its ongoing conflict with France has led it to compromise on several key issues, including territorial concessions and military aid. These concessions have significant implications for Great Britain's long-term goals and relationships with other European powers. The treaty's guarantee of neutrality also masks deeper tensions between the two nations, which will eventually boil over into open conflict. In this context, the Treaty of Westminster can be seen as a temporary solution to an intractable problem, a stopgap measure that buys time, but ultimately fails to address underlying issues. As we examine the intricacies of this treaty, it becomes clear that its impact on international relations is more nuanced than initially meets the eye. The Treaty of Westminster is signed between Great Britain and Prussia, guaranteeing the neutrality unfolded through interacting constraints rather than one isolated trigger. Decision-makers operated within institutional limits, and each response narrowed the next available option. The evidence points to compounding risk rather than a single dramatic cause. That causal chain becomes clearer when incentives, governance, and timing are read together. The Treaty of Westminster's guarantee of neutrality had far-reaching implications for European power dynamics. Great Britain's concessions to Prussia set a precedent for future negotiations, but also created long-term liabilities. As the treaty took effect, other European nations began to reassess their alliances and priorities in light of the new reality. The balance of power in Europe shifted incrementally, with each country adjusting its position in response to the changed landscape. Prussia's newfound neutrality gave it greater latitude for expansion, but also created uncertainty among its allies. Great Britain's compromise on territorial concessions set a precedent for future conflicts over border control and resource access. The treaty's institutional effects were felt across Europe as nations adjusted their military strategies and diplomatic approaches to account for the changed environment. The Treaty of Westminster's impact on European power dynamics is still relevant today. The complex interplay between great powers in the 18th century has analogues in modern global politics. The concept of neutrality, once a guarantee, now often comes with significant strings attached. The legacy of this treaty can be seen in ongoing debates over border control and resource access. The nuanced balance between cooperation and competition in international relations remains a pressing concern. The consequences of the Treaty of Westminster continued to unfold as European nations grappled with the implications of Prussia's neutrality. Great Britain, seeking to maintain its influence in Europe, began to negotiate new alliances with smaller states, including the Dutch and the Swedes. Great Britain's pursuit of new alliances was driven by a desire to counterbalance Prussian power and protect its own interests. The Dutch and Swedish states were wary of British overtures, aware that their own neutrality was precarious given the shifting balance of power in Europe. As Great Britain negotiated with these smaller states, it was forced to make concessions on trade and territorial control, further eroding its influence in the region. The consequences of these concessions would have far-reaching implications for European politics, as other nations began to question the value of neutrality in the face of great power competition. The Treaty of Westminster's emphasis on neutralization had created a fragile equilibrium, but it was clear that this balance could not be sustained indefinitely without significant adjustments to the underlying dynamics of international relations. The legacy of the Treaty of Westminster continued to shape European politics in the centuries that followed. As great powers vied for influence and resources, the concept of neutrality became increasingly complex and nuanced. In the early 20th century, the rise of fascist and nationalist movements in Europe led to a re-evaluation of the role of neutrality in international relations. The Spanish Civil War served as a catalyst for this re-evaluation, with many nations grappling with whether to maintain their neutral stance or intervene on behalf of the Republican government. This debate played out against the backdrop of a shifting global landscape, with the League of Nations struggling to contain the growing threat of aggressive powers like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The failure of the League to prevent these aggressions led to widespread disillusionment with the ideal of neutrality as a guarantee of peace and security. In response, international relations began to shift towards a more realpolitik approach, where nations prioritized their own interests over abstract notions of neutrality or morality. This new era of great power politics was exemplified by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which marked a significant departure from traditional notions of neutrality and non-aggression treaties. The consequences of the Treaty of Westminster's concessions had far-reaching implications for European politics. The emphasis on neutralization created a fragile equilibrium that could not be sustained indefinitely without adjustments to international relations. The legacy of the treaty continued to shape European politics, influencing the rise and fall of empires and the balance of power. The concept of neutrality became increasingly complex as great powers vied for influence and resources, leading to a re-evaluation of its role in international relations. In the early 20th century, fascist and nationalist movements in Europe challenged traditional notions of neutrality, with many nations grappling with whether to maintain their neutral stance or intervene on behalf of one side. The Spanish Civil War served as a catalyst for this debate, with the League of Nations struggling to contain the growing threat of aggressive powers like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The pact allowed both powers to pursue their respective goals without interference, but it also created a precarious balance that would eventually collapse under the weight of German aggression. European nations were forced to re-evaluate their alliances and strategic partnerships in light of this new reality, leading to a period of heightened tensions and diplomatic maneuvering. The aftermath of the pact saw the rise of isolationist policies in many countries, as leaders sought to prioritize domestic interests over international entanglements. This shift had significant governance consequences, as nations began to adopt more protectionist trade policies and withdraw from international institutions like the League of Nations. However, not all nations followed this path. Some continued to pursue a more engagement-based foreign policy, seeking to mitigate the risks associated with great power competition through multilateral cooperation and diplomacy. The British government, led by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, adopted a policy of appeasement towards Nazi Germany in an effort to avoid another devastating war, exemplified by the Munich Agreement of 1938. This approach ultimately failed to prevent German aggression, but it did provide a temporary reprieve from the devastation of war and allowed Britain to focus on rebuilding its economy and military lines. The escalating pressures of great power competition led to increased tensions between European nations. The rise of aggressive powers like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan forced countries to reevaluate their alliances and strategic partnerships. Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 was a significant escalation, as it directly challenged the Treaty of Versailles and the principle of collective security. The League of Nations' inability to effectively address these aggressions eroded its credibility and led to a decline in international cooperation. Countries like Italy, under Mussolini's leadership, began to pursue an expansionist foreign policy, seeking to create a new Roman Empire through military conquest and territorial acquisition. This new reality created significant economic consequences, as countries were forced to allocate increasingly large sums of their budgets towards military expenditure, diverting resources away from domestic development and social welfare programs. The failure of the League's collective security mechanism was starkly illustrated by its inability to prevent Japan's invasion of China in 1937, which had devastating humanitarian consequences and marked a significant escalation of the conflict. As the situation continued to deteriorate, leaders began to prioritize their national interests above all else, leading to increased tensions between great powers and reduced willingness to engage in multilateral cooperation or diplomacy. The rise of fascist and nationalist movements in Europe created a perfect storm of instability, with countries like Germany, Italy, and Japan pursuing aggressive expansionist policies. Germany's remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 was a significant escalation, as it directly challenged the Treaty of Versailles and the principle of collective security. The League of Nations' inability to effectively address these aggressions eroded its credibility and led to a decline in international cooperation. Countries like Italy, under Mussolini's leadership, began to pursue an expansionist foreign policy, seeking to create a new Roman Empire through military conquest and territorial acquisition. This new reality created significant economic consequences, as countries were forced to allocate increasingly large sums of their budgets towards military expenditure, diverting resources away from domestic development and social welfare programs. The failure of the League's collective security mechanism was starkly illustrated by its inability to prevent Japan's invasion of China in 1937, which had devastating humanitarian consequences and marked a significant escalation of the conflict. As tensions continued to rise, countries like Germany began to abandon diplomatic niceties and pursue a more aggressive foreign policy, with Hitler issuing ultimatums and making provocative speeches that heightened the sense of crisis. The League's inability to address these new realities ultimately led to its demise, marking a significant shift in international relations as countries were forced to rely on their own military strength rather than collective security mechanisms. Thanks for listening to Underwire History. Look forward to seeing you next time.